Hey guys, welcome again to another episode of Here We Grow at the Hive Garden Studios. As you already know, I'm going to get him to introduce himself, but first I just want to say how amazing this individual is from when I first ever met him many years ago to actually sitting here with him again and now diving in deeper to who he actually is.
Desiree, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Roger Mavity. I used to be an ad man for a long time, then I got a proper job, and then I ended up running a design company, and then I wrote some books.
Where were you born and raised, Roger?
I was born on Tyneside actually, but everybody says you can't be a Geordie because you don't have that magic accent, and I don't. So I'm a posh Geordie because my parents were quite sort of middle class. But I grew up on Tyneside. Because they were those sort of people and they cared about education, they sent me to a posh boarding school, which was the most tragic waste of money. I hated it, not in the sense I didn't have a nice time there, but in the sense that I thought what the school was about making people conform to a predetermined idea of what a good person should be. My idea of what a good person should be didn't match very well with theirs. I wanted to do arty things and creative things and write, and they wanted me to be a lawyer or an accountant because that's what places like that always do. But I eventually escaped and real life started when I got a job.
Tell us about this journey that you started.
Well,
This job.
I was miserable at school in the sense I didn't achieve anything, and I know from my parents' point of view it was very, very important for me to have a good education and make a success of it. I failed at that spectacularly. I was terrible at sport. I wasn't much good at work either, and I didn't get on with the teachers because I didn't really like or respect them, a feeling which they also had for me. I thought if I could get to a good university, that would kind of prove to my parents it was okay, and the feeling that I had that I was constantly failing would just evaporate. About the only thing I was any good at school was English, so I thought I'll work in television or journalism or advertising or something like that. And there was a very good local TV company in those days in Tyneside, so the next day I got a bus to their offices and I walked in and I said I'd come about the job. And the lady on reception who didn't have me on her list looked a bit puzzled.
Oh, so you've just rocked up.
Yeah, absolutely. And said, "What job?" And I said, "I don't mind. You know, I'm flexible. Whatever suits you. I'm happy to produce programs, direct them." So she got on the phone to the guy in charge of getting slightly mad people off the premises before it causes trouble. And he very sweetly said that you really need to work for a newspaper first. So I thanked him for that, and I got back on the bus and I went to the offices of the local newspapers. Newcastle, also quite good. I was a bit more street smart about interview technique at this point, so I said to the reception, "I'm sorry, I'm 5 minutes late. I've got an appointment with the editor." So the editor appeared looking very nervous and apologised that he didn't have the meeting in the diary. I said, "Well, actually, it wasn't a meeting. It was just a bluff because I'm desperate. I want a job working for you." And he said, "Well, you really need to have some experience working for a smaller paper." So I thanked him and got on the bus home, and that was the end of my glorious career in British television and my glorious career in British journalism. My father came home that evening and said, "How did you do?" And I said, "Well, in the sense you mean, did I get a job? I did rather badly, but in the sense that I mean, I felt absolutely exhilarated because what I discovered was I actually had the courage to go in and ask.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how often in life you realise that the reason that people don't get what they want is because they didn't ask for it in the first place.
Yes.
So it kind of inspired me to believe in myself for the first time. And eventually I managed to wangle a job in an advertising agency at the humblest level. And eventually I managed to claw my way up from the bottomest rung of the ladder. And that's what I did for a few years. And I realised quite quickly I was quite good at it.
Yeah.
Because I've always been interested in how people talk to each other and how they persuade each other to do things and the psychology of that. And that's really what advertising's about. And I got quite a good job and I had a nice flat and a nice car and a nice salary. The one thing I did have, which I didn't want, was I also had a boss. And he was a very nice guy, but by that time I'd realised that working isn't just about paying the rent, it's about proving something to yourself.
Yes.
And I thought, if I'm going to prove to myself I'm not the failure that school had educated me to believe I was, I've actually got to start my own business. Ran my own business for 10 years, and it was mostly great fun. And at the end of it, I sold it and went off to do something else.
And what was that something else?
I went to work for Granada, which is a huge British corporation.
Yeah.
Owns lots of different businesses, or it did then, including the TV company, which makes Coronation Street and all of those wonderful things. And they had been very badly run and were losing money hand over fist. They brought in a new guy called Jerry Robinson, who was a charming Irishman. And I knew Jerry because he'd been one of the clients of my advertising agency in the past.
Okay.
And we got on very well. So he said, look, I'm desperate for some new people. Why don't you come and work here? And I just thought it would be so exciting to work somewhere which was huge. So I went there, and it was fantastic.
What was your role there?
It changed over time, but originally they were trying to sort out a business which was a huge collection of businesses, mostly in a mess. I was given about 8 companies which I had to chair, all of which were losing money, and we would have sold any of them if we could, but nobody's going to buy a business which is losing money. So my job was to try and turn it round. So I became a kind of company doctor, more or less by mistake. And I loved it because I didn't know what I was doing. And I did that for 10 years, and then I chaired a PR company for a bit, and then a guy called Terence Conran, who you probably wouldn't know of because you're of a much younger generation. But in his day, Terence was quite a revolutionary designer as well as businessman. He'd set up a number of businesses, some of them in restaurants, some of them were in design and furniture design, and he wanted a new chief executive. So I went to work with him for a bit, and I started writing books, and I started taking photographs, and left an office job.
So you mentioned that you then went into photography and writing books.
Yeah.
What was the transition?
Well, the book writing thing happened entirely by mistake, and it just shows I've always felt that being cross is quite constructive. Because when you're not cross, when you're relaxed, you're not thinking, how can we make this a better world? Because you already feel okay.
Yeah.
When you're thinking, how can we do things better? It's actually when you're dissatisfied. And I had a reputation of being quite a good pitcher when I was in advertising. Because actually, if you work in advertising, the only 2 things you learn are where the good restaurants are and how to pitch, because that's what you have to do all the time. And I got quite good at it, and a friend of mine was writing a book about it, and he interviewed me for the book, and one of the chapters was about this interview. And he sent me a copy of it, and I took it upstairs one evening at home while Jack was downstairs cooking dinner in the kitchen. And I read this, and it was so bad, and it so trivialized the issue. And I thought he'd really traduced my ideas and sold them short, and it just sent me into a rage. And I do what all men do, which is, when they're cross, is they blame their wife, whatever it is. So I tore downstairs, and I said to my wife, how did you let me contribute to this book? It's absolutely awful. I'm embarrassed to have my name on the back cover. And she said, Roger, you're always complaining about something. If you want a better book on pitching, I suggest you piss off upstairs and write it yourself. And I thought, actually, that's quite a good idea. And I went upstairs and I started to make notes on it. And a while later, I was talking to a friend of mine, Stephen Bailey, who was the first director of the Design Museum, bright guy. And I'd talking to him, and he said, it's a great idea. We should write the book together. So eventually we did. And to my amazement, it was really quite successful. And that was called Life's a Pitch. That was the first book I did. Yeah. You know, that was 15 years ago now. The book's still in print. It's been republished several times. It's even been published in Japanese.
Oh, wow.
And I still get asked to do talks about it. So I think pitching, how you sell yourself, how you sell your ideas, how you interview for a job, how you do a PowerPoint, all that stuff, people are surprisingly anxious about it.
Considering as well, Roger, that you were turned down by so many colleges.
Well, I've got good practice at rejection. I think it's an important life lesson. You don't learn anything from your successes. You learn from your failures. I had a very interesting discussion once. I met a guy called Biz Stone, who was one of the 2 guys that set up Twitter. And he was in London to promote a book, and I met him. And I was interested because Twitter must have exploded from being 2 guys in a garage somewhere in Los Angeles to being a worldwide thing in seconds. And I said to him, how do you recruit people? How do you hire people when you've got to move that fast? How do you know somebody's going to be good? You have to make decisions very, very quickly. And he said, well, when I'm hiring people, I always look for failure. And I thought it was a rather strange thing to say. And I said, can you explain that a bit? He said, well, people who've been very successful, they're characterized by two things. One is they're rather irritatingly smug. And secondly, they haven't actually learnt anything. Because when things go well, you just think, I knew they would, I'm very clever, aren't I? So the time you learn is when things go wrong. So if I'm interviewing somebody that's really had something that's been a big setback, and he's had to struggle with it, or she's had to struggle with it, and found some way around it, then you found somebody who's learned something.
Yeah.
So I think setbacks are a very important part of life's education, really.
It pushes you
Yeah.
really, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Like into wanting to make it happen and to prove to yourself, like, these people can't determine what my future's about.
No, one of the things I've noticed is throughout my working life is that most people imagine things to be difficult and complicated. Well, they're certainly sometimes difficult, but usually at heart they're in fact quite simple.
Yeah, that's very true. And tell us, we have How to Steal Fire. What was the inspiration behind this book?
Again, it happened by mistake, oddly enough. Stephen and I did Life's a Pitch. Stephen also knew Terence Conran very well because he'd set up the Design Museum with Terence. He was coming towards the end of his life. It'd been an extraordinary career, and I said to Stephen, why don't we do a biography of him? So we agreed to do that, and we wrote it. And we then got into the most incredible legal wrangle with Terence, who's a brilliant guy, was also quite narcissistic, and didn't want anybody saying anything about him which was less than flattering. And actually, we all know that people who are very brilliant are also quite tricky, usually.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to admit that. So we got into a legal wrangle and the book stalled. And the publisher said one day, actually, you're both interested in the creative world. We've got this legal thing which could go on practically forever. Why didn't you write a book about creativity? So we wrote How to Steal Fire really as a kind of way of filling the gap.
Wow. I love how you just always look at it, but you've just said it, I think. Failure, you basically learn from that and you improve with failure. So from that setback, it's made you think out the box and into this amazing book here. So
You don't know it's amazing because you haven't read it yet.
I know it's amazing, Roger. I know it's amazing because your work alone speaks for itself.
Oh, you're very sweet.
With everything that you've done, Roger, what advice would you give to those coming into the industry? What advice would you give to them to be as successful as you?
Believe in yourself. Most people's internal landscape is riddled by self-doubt and anxiety. No wonder it's hard to get something done. And, of course, how your personality is radiates to other people. So, of course, if you feel self-doubt, people around you aren't inspired by you. So I think you've got to kind of rejig your mindset and think, I can do stuff and I believe in myself, completely regardless of whether in my own case I've had no experience, no training, no apparent talent or education for something. You just go for it anyway. But most people have got more than they think. They've just buried them a bit. So I think the first thing is you've got to believe in yourself. The second thing is you've got to be willing to take a risk. Because if you try to do something, more often than not, you'll fail. But if you don't try and do it, you've failed already. So what's better, an 80% chance of failure or a 100% chance of failure?
A space like the Hive, what would that have meant for you growing up with all these setbacks and having a space where you can just come in and create and meet other creatives, use the space at affordable prices? What would that have meant for you?
I'm sure the Hive's got all sorts of resources and facilities and cameras that work and microphones that sound crisp and blah, blah, blah. And that's all fine, good. But actually, I'm sure what it's also got is people who are interested in how they communicate to the wider world. And you get so much from talking to people like that. It's very inspiring.
Would you then say that networking is a very, very big deal when you're in the creative industry?
I think it's a big deal in life because you just learn from talking to other people.
Yeah, networking for us. That's why we hold quite a few networking events within the year for other creatives to be meeting up with one another, sharing their ideas, even collaboration, as you have done with your books.
Yeah.
Could you have done this on your own, writing books?
What if's a difficult question to answer, isn't it? All I can say is I've enjoyed doing it, and I've largely done it with the help of other people. As it happens, a very good personal friend of mine, he's a neighbour, I didn't work with him, was a lawyer who specialised in the media. So he knew lots of publishers and publishing agents. And when Stephen and I started to work on Life's a Pitch, my mate introduced me to a very good agent. So those contacts are really helpful, and you have to work at it.
What's been the most favourite moments for you?
I don't know. I'm waiting. I always think what happens next is much more important than what happened yesterday. I've got dozens of great memories, but I'm interested in tomorrow. There's a brilliant book by Trollope, The Eustace Diamonds, and one character is going on about the past and being very kind of English, and we're obsessed with bloody heritage and tradition, and I think English people do tend to live in the past. And this character in the Eustace Diamonds is a bit like that, and the person he's talking to says to him very coldly, "The past is lost to us, the future is all we have." And I thought that is so eloquent.
Wow.
So yeah, I've got lots of good memories, but actually the best memory is the one that I'm working on for next week, not one from last week. Does that make sense?
Of course it does. You've just made me think about my own self and what I used to think, I used to like this moment, but how could it be your favorite? What I'm getting from this, how could it be your favorite where you don't know what's happening tomorrow? One thing I actually want to ask you, your photos, where did the ideas come from? And I mean the ones with like the ladies wearing their birthday suits.
I did eventually get to university, but I was 62 when I got there, because eventually, when I started to study photography seriously, I applied to the University of Westminster to do a master's degree, which I did. It was very exhilarating. I loved it, and I learnt lots from the other people on the course. But I got an amazing amount of stick from the women because they thought my photographs objectified their gender, which they probably do.
This is my definition. No matter in what position, how you look, whatever you're doing, you are still who you are, and I'm still seeing that beauty in you.
Thank you. But I think on just staying for 10 secs on the photographs, very difficult coming up with a good idea, because people, if you say you're a photographer, they imagine that you walk around with a camera taking photographs of things that you see. I don't. I spend absolutely months trying to develop an idea and work out how it's going to be staged. And then I set it all up, and then I take the dust off the camera and take the photograph. So the actual photography is quite a late moment in the process. But I spend a lot of time going to art galleries and looking at art books and looking at paintings that I admire, and really trying to learn from how other people have expressed themselves. And eventually just something comes.
Thank you so much, Roger.
Desiree, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure having you here, and I hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.